You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. My next guest is Ilya Zaslavskiy. Ilya is a research expert at Free Russia Foundation and also an energy consultant. Ilya, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
Absolutely. We have several things that I would like to discuss that I think that you have some very interesting expertise on. And the first I'd like to touch on is the idea of, the concept of sanctions. This is something that the European sanctions against Russia and American sanctions against Russia, this has been something that has developed into kind of an ongoing subject of conversation. It's viewed one way in Russia. It is viewed differently in America. In America, we have a history of sanctions with different countries with mixed results. Most notably, probably for most people, would be sanctions against Iran. And I think even now that sanctions have been lifted, if you ask different people about the impact that those sanctions had, they will give you different opinions of whether sanctions are effective or not. So let's start with, do you feel that sanctions have been imposed on Russia, whether it is for annexation of Crimea or for the hybrid war, as Russia sometimes is referred to, having a war in eastern Ukraine? What impact do you feel that those sanctions have had on Russia?
I think current sanctions are quite superficial. And they've been applied sort of reluctantly and very mildly, as the only alternative was no action at all, or full-scale conflict or harsh sanctions. Sort of Iran-style sanctions are much harsher. They actually prohibit export of oil and gas from Iran. They stopped all financial operations with Iran. Nothing like that happened with Russia. So current sanctions, they just sort of send a signal to Russia what more can come if Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine continues. And they have created what one could call a chilling effect on Russian investments. They have prevented some Russian companies from borrowing in the West, although Russians have been quite amazing in circumventing even those sanctions and still being able to borrow in the West and continue operations in the West. So I would say that these sanctions are quite weak, and they don't achieve their main objective in reversing Russian policy. They just help to maybe reduce Russian resources available for war a little bit.
But Russian economy seems to be in such a dire straits right now and continues to decline. Is it all purely based on the price of gas and oil, or do sanctions make a difference?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I actually cover it in my latest research called The Tsar and His Business Serfs, published by Martin's Center in Brussels. You can find it online. It's a matter of dispute. What had a bigger impact on Russia? Its own systemic inefficiency, which was present already before.
And systemic inefficiency, and we will visit this more, but systemic inefficiency can really refer also to a huge level of corruption.
Level of corruption and lack of free market, dominance of state corporations and state-controlled entities over private competition. So Russia was already experiencing decline and inefficiency around 2012-2013. And then obviously oil price has a huge impact as well. So I would say that those two factors, bad competition, corruption, and low oil price, they have much bigger impact than this chilling effect from sanctions. Although, I mean, obviously, cumulatively, they act. That's a force which is stronger.
You know, and I've heard this idea before that the sanctions aren't really hurting who they're designed to hurt. They're very specific, and as you mentioned, the people that it's aimed at have been fairly successful at finding ways around and getting money. But nonetheless, it seems that the war in eastern Ukraine has not progressed as Russia may have wanted in the beginning, that the Crimea is not being recognized by international community, has great economic impact on Crimea and on Russia, where it sucks a lot of the resources from the center to support this newly annexed territory. But in the end, you still feel that there's other things that have had more impact, and the sanctions at best, provided an excuse or exacerbated certain outcomes. What do you think?
I think the main reason why Russian aggression stopped in eastern Ukraine had nothing to do with sanctions. It had to do with resistance of Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people, and Putin just realized that he would have to commit tens of thousands of troops and in a total bloodbath, and it would not be sustainable, even with huge losses, because even if you occupy Ukraine, or even half of Ukraine, you would then have to you would have then to face practically guerrilla war, and Ukrainians have proven that they've been quite well in that during Second World War and before that. So that was not an option for him, not because of sanctions. As for Crimea, it's turned into a very gray zone, a gray economic zone with lots of criminality and lots of illegal activity, as have other areas where Russia has meddled in post-Soviet space. So we see the same situation in South Ossetia, in Transnistria, and some other places. Actually, given that Russian regime is full of criminals and full of corrupt officials, actually some of them make money out of that. There is a brilliant article by Mark Galeotti from NYU, who just shows that Crimea became this new El Dorado for some of these criminals, including those who are part of the regime. So I would actually distinguish between interests of Russia as a country and regime in the Kremlin. The situation in Crimea is actually quite suitable for current people in the Kremlin, and I don't think they're bothered that much with some of the repercussions from annexation of Crimea. So to return to sanctions, I think they are just a response from Western policymakers who don't know what else better they can do. So this is like a bad and weak response from the West, because they just couldn't come up with anything better. And the thing is, in my view, the West faces a choice. Either they are ready to escalate the conflict and endure some costs, some relatively limited costs, but still tangible costs, like lower consumption of oil and gas, less trade with Russia and some of the post-Soviet states dominated by Russia. They would have to, increase their spending on military. So some tangible and serious costs which leaders of the West have to sell to their voters and electorate in the West. Or they can do what they do now, just really present very superficial sanctions, just not to appear to be appeasing Russia, but really it's 1 inch. What's happening right now? It's just like 1 inch away from appeasing.
But it's okay. All right. So then, yeah, what is, since you are the expert, what is this? What is the solution? Is the solution to build up army and to surround Russia with NATO forces, or is the solution to have stronger sanctions, or is what should the West do?
I mean, it all depends on what's your long-term objective and how you assess the situation right now. Because, in my view, current policymakers and opinion makers and society in general in the West, they still don't see much danger coming out of Russia for themselves. They think that Russia is just meddling in Ukraine and it's near broad space. That it could be a corrupt state, but basically it's them. It has little to do with us. Under that scenario, it's if they are correct, maybe current policies are okay, because current policy is not like I'm not saying it's illogical. It aims to sort of slowly strangle Russia's power, just squeeze, make fewer resources available to Russia through chilling effect of sanctions, and force them to change maybe after 5 years or so. So it's a strategy of very long patience. So that's one thing. If you assess the risks coming out of Russia differently, as I do, and many other people do, I think that Russia is capable. A current regime in Russia is capable of inflicting much more damage to the West itself through starting from cyber attacks and outright criminal activity of its criminal gangs. We saw a number of cases emerging from Spanish prosecution about Russian organized crime in Europe. We saw some other reports. And it could inflict damage in many other different ways by actually exporting its values and practices. Russia is in the lead of many other kleptocratic states in post-Soviet space, and I would maybe add that there are other states in G20 who now believe in crony capitalism. It's called crony capitalism or state capitalism. So I would say it's in a way it's a standoff between G7 and G13 within G20. So the countries like China, South Africa, Brazil, they're and others in G20, they're actually quite prone to corruption and to ways of Russian-style capitalism, much more than within G7. And actually within G7 as well, there is difference. Some countries like Italy, they're also, they've been in a way subdued by people like Berlusconi and the corruption of their own. So just to finish, I think the danger in the long term is much more apparent to experts, and solutions require costs from the West, considerable costs today, in order to avoid even bigger costs tomorrow.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, The Edge, WSUW in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin, and we're speaking today with Ilya Zaslavskiy, who is a research expert at Free Russia Foundation and an energy consultant. He just authored a report on the state of corruption in Russia, especially when it has to do with small and medium-sized businesses. Ilya, when we're speaking about small and medium-sized businesses in a situation in a country where the entire country is covered by this epidemic of corruption, and as you just referenced, state capitalism or crony capitalism really just means that state players own all the big assets. What environment is there left for the small business to operate in. I mean, it really seems like competition is not what it's about.
It sounds absolutely right. I mean, their main reaction to depressed economy and sanctions has been to go into shadow economy and also just to cut costs, to embark on very big austerity. I mean, there have been some small protests, sort of disparate protests among some farmers, among some owners of small kiosks,
truck drivers.
But even them, they haven't challenged Putin or Kremlin or foreign policy or domestic policy of the Kremlin. They only challenged the government and only on economic issues. And actually, many of them tried to appeal to Putin. The most visible image to me in that story was when some owners of kiosks would put a photo of Putin next to icons in the windows of their shops, and then excavators would still come around and destroy them.
Well, and that works in two ways, because on one hand, as a result of political cleansing, there's nobody else but Putin that people can associate with having any power in the country. And at the same time, they also want to send a message that they are pro-Putin. God forbid they're not opposition.
Exactly. Yes. There is this sort of belief in a good czar, and also if you don't stick your neck too much out and you just ask for, economic things, then you'll be okay. But these people have been proven wrong again and again, and they just don't learn.
So, to kind of connect our first part of our conversation with this, the sanctions, have they hit large businesses differently than small businesses? And what is the impact of those has been on that small business?
As I said, it's very difficult to disentangle and calculate the exact portion of the impact from sanctions versus from low oil price and from just overall bad economy, corrupt economy. Some people try to do it. I think overall the mainstream consensus is that corruption and low oil price impact more than sanctions, and sanctions, they just add to inability to get loans and technology to buy fancy imports, but they haven't been the main cause of the depression in the economy. I would say the biggest effect is this chilling effect, something which is just a perception that undermines investor confidence. So it's not very tangible, and it doesn't necessarily directly impact businesses, but it's something that impacts their perception of should they just go into, should they invest more into legitimate business, or should they just scale back and take some money out into the shadow economy? That's, I think, the biggest impact.
Do you feel that it makes sense for anybody to either invest money in Russia or to start businesses in Russia right now?
I mean, it makes sense to some very risky speculators who like volatile markets, especially on stock exchange. Otherwise, I think many Western businesses just turned away from Russia. I mean, some of the sellers of luxury consumer goods, they still continue. There's still some market for them among Muscovites and people from big cities. But I wouldn't invest my own money in Russia right now. Definitely not.
All right. There's a very interesting situation developing right now with Putin, where he is in a process of switching the people at some of the key positions. And one of the ideas and theories that I've heard that makes a reasonable amount of sense is when a dictator first goes up, he makes sure that all his good buddies and good friends are occupying all the good positions. But then as time goes on, he becomes so much, rises so much above his friends. And so now he's got a problem of people who may remember him before he was in power. And so now it seems like Putin is replacing his old friends with bodyguards in a position of governors of different areas, because at least he's sure of those people's loyalty. How does all of that shift in oligarchy affects the money streams as well as corruption and other issues?
I think you're partially right in that assessment. Indeed, he doesn't want any charismatic people around him, or any people with any political face or independence, even marginal one.
He hardly tolerates people that are taller than him.
That's another thing. That's true. So he puts these gray suits who nobody knows in these positions of power, who are completely subordinate to him. I think one of the other theories I've heard is that he himself just knows much more about the bad state, how bad the state of the economy is, and that he's doing this reshuffles with the thought of what may come soon, when much bigger economic crisis happens. I mean, I can only guess. I do think some bigger economic crisis is about to come, but I'm not sure how much bigger, because the official numbers they're not trustworthy as well. As everything else that comes from this regime, not only election results. But just to return to his recruitment and employment policy, we had a very interesting meeting here in Washington when a friend of mine, Anastasia Kirilenko, brought a film which she made, which is called "Who is Mr. Putin?" and it's available online on Radio Liberty website. It's available in Russian. I think it will soon come out with English subtitles. And Anastasia, together with another American researcher, Karin Dawisha, who wrote a book, Putin's Kleptocracy, they looked at origins of Putin and how he made his first money and first political power in St. Petersburg in 1990s. And the biggest feature about that is that Putin has always employed criminal gangs and criminal connections, which KGB had for many years before him. And he created this dedicated group of people in St. Petersburg, which now is essentially in power. Most of these people from St. Petersburg are now in power. So this coherent group, which one could call an organized crime group, others could call it mafia state. I would call it just a very sort of poisonous blend of ex-KGB people, Communist Party people, some people with connections in the criminal world, not necessarily criminals themselves, who blended together and who have this very sort of dedicated view of life and a strong hierarchy. And they're all, there is this notion of krugovaya poruka, which in English could be translated as collective gang responsibility. So like a typical mob practice where a group of people are connected to each other by collective crime, involvement in some collective crimes.
They all have blood on their hands.
Not necessarily. I mean, some of them probably have blood on their hands. Most of it is...
I would imagine the amount of blood varies.
Most of it, I think, is money laundering, all sorts of corruption. So Putin has successfully, from those days to these days, he has employed that collective gang responsibility. And so many of these people around him, both officials and oligarchs, they are tied to him through this collective responsibility. So to return back to your question, I don't see any split of elites, any oligarchs who are sort of against Putin. In my study, I list all the loyal statements that oligarchs have made to Putin in the last 2 years. And there is literally not a single oligarch, especially connected to Russian economy, to mineral extraction sectors, or to some tangible economy. None of them are even remotely, protesting Putin. I thought of only 2 people, and it took me like a lot of time to come up. There are 2 oligarchs who, in my view, went through some transformation over the last 20 years, and they're both in the West now. Pavel Durov, the creator of social network Vkontakte, the analog of Facebook, Russian Facebook, and another guy, Yuri Milner. He is also IT guy, nothing to do with mineral extraction industry. So he is now in Silicon Valley. So these are the only 2 people who are not known that well in the West or even in Russia. And even them, I mean, they're not perfect. All the rest, like literally several hundred people who are top of Russia's Forbes list, they're all connected to the regime through various ties, including criminal ties. And there is no way they're going to present any political resistance to Putin. So to sum up, the thing is, why I'm bringing this all up is there's this very popular myth among Western policymakers that somehow, these sanctions and this bad, aggressive foreign policy, it will create split of elites. No, it won't. So unless you really create very harsh sanctions, this regime will continue as it is, and all these oligarchs will stay loyal.
Okay. Ilya, before we shift to next topic, I wanted to briefly touch on something that you touched on in your answer as well, and that's the trustworthiness of the information that comes out of the system. Russian power system. I think that Russian people, and I'm speaking broadly by citizens of Russian Federation, have a clear understanding that you really can't trust anything that comes out of the government. It is being spun for specific purposes, and release of information is not what it's about. And I think that's pretty clear because it starts with Mr. Putin, who is a former KGB officer and views information as a tool that he can use in his purposes. Not to mention that, particularly recently, it seems like everything he says, the reality is exactly the opposite. But what are your thoughts as a researcher as to how much trust can a Western audience put into the information that comes out of Kremlin? I mean, they have an official spokespersons. Should we disregard what they say? Should we treat it skeptically? Should we believe it? What are your thoughts?
Earlier I was referring to very specific, like macroeconomic data, so inflation rate, GDP growth, even those very specific numbers, which are supposed to be apolitical, they're not trustworthy in my view. They should be taken with some degree of skepticism. But, they're probably not completely fake, but there is a significant margin of distortion, I would say that. But otherwise, of course, on global, international issues, Kremlin has been dedicated to present deliberately fabricated information. So lately, everything that came out on MH17 flight and it's the downing of that airplane in Ukraine, or on events in Syria when they bombed the convoy, UN convoy. It's all just Minister of Nazi propaganda Goebbels would be very proud of the ways Kremlin presents such information right now. Otherwise, what worries me the most and the biggest lesson for the West, in my view, is to stop treating Russian legal system as legitimate.
A system that either has legality or is a system.
Anything that comes from prosecution office, from investigation, from Ministry of Justice, on international on events of international importance, or for criminal investigations in the West. So, for example, Spanish prosecution has been looking into Russian organized crime in Europe for many years now. It's been covered in WikiLeaks and many newspapers. So for some time, for a very long time, they actually tried to cooperate with Russian Ministry of Justice, with Ministry of Internal Affairs, and those ministries and all other law enforcement in Russia, they deliberately and in a very sophisticated way actually meddled with objective investigation. They tried to cover criminals. They wanted to confuse Western investigators. So it wasn't like just not giving information. They were deliberately counteracting any attempts to bring justice. And we can see it in many other cases, with Magnitsky case, with all sorts of cases which are reviewed by European Court of Human Rights. The implication for me is that the West should start thinking about treating Russia and some other post-Soviet states as legally failed states. So any information coming from their law enforcement or Ministry of Justice and so on should be treated from the outset, should be treated with suspicion. So there should be no presumption of innocence there. There should be presumption of fabrication. And if we do acknowledge such reality, which I think we should, then there are very serious consequences. I think, for example, the U.S. Congress would then have to come up with some system to deal with legally failed states. How do you sign economic agreements with such states? How do you how do you enact all clauses in different agreements? So there is a whole chain of actions that you have to take after that.
Ilya, you made me curious. Is there a precedent of this legally failed state?
It's a good question. It's something that I haven't researched enough myself.
So that could be the subject of your next paper, perhaps?
Exactly. I would say, for example, no one treats North Korea or Afghanistan until recently as a legally normal state. So if say North Korean Ministry of Justice sends you some documents, immediately you have suspicion about them rather than trust. I'm not sure that it's ingrained in law and some particular formal structures, but at least there is this attitude which is lacking about Russia, I think. So, no, it's a complicated question. It's not like something that can be done overnight, and there is no easy solution. But it's definitely... So, as I said, the first step is just to acknowledge the scale of the problem.
I think what you're speaking about is a paradigm. and a certain paradigm shift that is required when dealing with countries like Russia, where you just shift the paradigm from thinking that you're dealing with another country like any other country, and coming to a realization that you're not. All right, so
exactly.
I'll reset one more time. You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report. I'm Yuri Rashkin, and my guest today is Ilya Zaslavskiy, who is a research expert at the Free Russia Foundation and an energy consultant. And he's speaking with us from Washington, D.C., but Ilya, I'd like to spend the last few minutes kind of talking about your story a little bit and the journey that you went through where you were working, you left Russia and then you came back to Russia and you worked for a Western company. You were charged with crime that this is pretty much routine. People get charged with crimes in order to either affect them or to affect their employer. In your case, it sounds like it was actually your company that Russian oligarchs or government or the system really was after. And then you left and were able to leave and came to the West, came back out, and you're an Oxford graduate, and you discovered that your university was in really good relationship with some of the people that were looking to put you and your employer either in jail or out of business because they are contributing large sums of money to Oxford and to probably other schools out west, as the question of legitimizing all this stolen money is such a relevant question for the oligarchs. But it sounds like you've been fighting this battle pretty hard. So why don't you tell us about it?
Yes, everything you said is pretty much correct. I worked in TNK-BP, which was a Russian subsidiary of British Petroleum, BP, where Anglo-American company BP owned 50%, and then Russian oligarchs from AAR consortium, together with Russian security services, FSB, they decided to take over operational control of the company, and so they did with a lot of state agency support and very vile propaganda. So they presented me and my brother, who had nothing to do with that company, as an organized crime group who failed to do some espionage. They never said for who and with what motive. But then they tried to implicate even British Council as a spy platform as well. And this case has been covered widely in WikiLeaks reports of U.S. Embassy in Moscow in 2008 and 2009. And my judge and prosecutor are now on the list of gross human rights violators of U.S. Congress, called Magnitsky list. They're on that list not because of my case, but right at the same time these officials were involved in some other fabricated cases.
It's very nice of you to say. You could just say it's because of me that they're all being prosecuted.
No. I try to stay objective. I mean, I have written about this case and talked about it extensively. There are many other layers how I have proved that it's been fabricated, but not on that level. I actually tried to add my prosecutor to Magnitsky list, and then it turned out U.S. State Department added him on their own while I was trying to do that. I recorded a podcast with International Spy Museum on this last month, covering this story, and there are many newspaper articles. But to return to Oxford, I was shocked to learn that top administrators and some tutors at Oxford knew perfectly well about this case, and they actually, some of them even provided references for us. And the Oxford student newspapers wrote about our case, pledging support to me and my brother, who is also a graduate of Oxford. And then they cooperated with these oligarchs. Firstly, it was Alpha Bank oligarchs Mikhail Friedman and Piotr Avin, who had a joint business award with Said Business School at Oxford in 2007-2011. And Oxford then quietly closed that award. I think because my suspicion, they did it because Department of Justice made a big investigation into the activity of one of their main international companies in telecommunications called Vimpelcom. And this year, Department of Justice fined Vimpelcom $795 million. And it's the biggest sort of bribe case, proven bribe case in their history. And then in 2010, Oxford University took money from another oligarch, Len Blavatnik, who likes to pose as a U.S. philanthropist, although Panama Papers revealed that he continues to have strong ties with Russian government. So he has. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. It's been written in Panama Papers that he has a joint entertainment business, digital entertainment business, with Deputy Minister of Russian Internal Affairs.
That's nice.
It's quite unbelievable, but this is Russia today for you. That's how it works. And I mean, there are many other controversies about these people, apart from how they corporate raided BP in Russia and how they engage with Russian government. And I've written extensively about that. But it's not. That's what you would expect of Russian oligarchs, but that's not what the cover-up which Oxford University administrators provided to these oligarchs. That's what unexpected. I first tried to persuade them quietly and diplomatically to just even look at my case and consider it and review maybe due diligence processes. They just patronized and dismissed me. So after censorship on this issue, I decided to take this to start a campaign. And so last year we published an article, an open letter on the front page of The Guardian, and it was signed by several prominent Russian dissidents, Vladimir Bukovsky, Pavel Litvinov, and by about over a dozen of other activists, political emigres, academics, alumni of Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard University. And since then, we have a petition on change.org, which many Western and Russian academics and alumni signed, including some famous names. And at some point, I decided to. I was separately. I had a letter exchange with Nadia Savchenko, a very well-known Ukrainian deputy who was in Russian prison because of the war. She was basically held as a hostage. And there's this online NGO called Rosuznik, where you can actually write to different prisoners in Russia. So we had this exchange with Nadia earlier this year.
That's just, let's stop for a second, because I think that is really interesting that, so there's a way that if somebody wants to, they can get in touch with a Russian prisoner via email?
No, how it works, you go to rosuznik.org.
Rosuznik, this would be like the Russian convict,
yes.
Like ROSUZNIK, something like that?
Yes, Rosuznik and .org, and then there are activists in Russia who then print out your letter and they take it to Russian prisons through whatever legitimate way there is to take the letters. And so, astonishingly, that worked, and
it did, because Nadia Savchenko has been, I guess cause célèbre would be one way to put it, but she managed to gain a huge amount of notoriety because of the circumstances surrounding her arrest or capture. And she went on several hunger strikes and nearly died in jail. And then she was convicted by Russian court or whatever in East Ukrainian, I think it's rebel-held territories there, and was given like 21 years of jail. And then after that, she was exchanged and sent back to Ukraine for a couple of people that were, significantly less than her in stature. And so it's kind of a, like, if people know Pussy Riot, Nadezhda Savchenko has been kind of a more of a political and military version of person that attracts a huge amount of attention and then becomes kind of maybe a pawn in political games, or depending on her own story and personality can, things develop. But Ms. Savchenko has been quite active in Ukrainian politics and in general is not going anywhere. And good for you for reaching out and connecting with her.
Yes, and I'm very grateful to her for her support to the petition that she provided. There have been other people, like former director of Kennan Institute, Professor Peter Redaway, and many others. I don't even want to list it, but you can find these names by going to change.org or just contacting me. And we continue this campaign. Oxford continues to pretend that nothing bad happened, and they now embarked on a very active counter-campaign of just silencing any debate or any discussion of this issue. The oligarchs who help them in that, they have so much money that they have penetrated the Western establishment not only in Europe but also in the US. They've been associated now with Yale University, Harvard University, with Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, where one of them received a corporate citizenship award. And the most Orwellian feature about these guys is that they've done so much abusive and controversial stuff in post-Soviet space, but here in the West, they're praised especially for their best business practices and governance. So they don't want just to make a name for being a philanthropist in biology they want best business practices and governance. And that's the most ridiculous and silly thing that one could imagine. And it would have been funny if it wasn't real.
Ilya, do you have any idea on the numbers as far as the amount of money that's been contributed either to Oxford or in general, or any numbers that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a secret. Len Blavatnik provided 75 million pounds to Oxford, and he pledged a bit more. And that's really kopecks to him. That's a fraction of what he received from Putin and Sechin just in one deal where Rosneft bought the company which they corporate raided in 2008. So Tenki BP, which they got control of in 2008, they sold it to state-controlled Rosneft for $28 billion in cash. And many analysts believe that at least $8 to $10 billion from that sum was an excessive amount, which cannot be explained by commercial logic. So it's a good business. Blavatnik alone received around 2 to 3 billion in excess of the market value of his stake. And then he goes to Oxford, gives 75 million pounds, and he's praised for, being a US philanthropist. And there is now even a joint course on governance in mineral extraction industry at that school. So in his name, they now teach how to be nice and honest in mineral extraction.
Well, some would say that what we saw in this country with Carnegie, not Dale Carnegie, but the other Carnegie, who made huge fortune with not necessarily best business practices. I'm trying to remember the industry, the steel industry, I think, that he had such a huge part in, and that turned into Carnegie Libraries, Carnegie Foundation. I mean, one of the organizations currently working hardest to preserve semblance of free speech in Russia is the Carnegie Foundation. And Mr. Carnegie himself was not all that nice or cared about democracy.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up. And I mean, I've heard, I've heard. It's definitely not completely black and white situation, and I've heard positions like yours from a number of people. So we should take it by stages, I think. So firstly, what happened with Carnegie or Cecil Rhodes or others like that happened like over 100 years ago. Since then, entities like universities like Oxford University, they have claimed that they have changed significantly, that there is no longer racial discrimination. There are very different values now. In their statutes, they talk about ethics. And so, for example, in terms of donations, they're supposed to have a very ethical committee to review donations, which is supposed to take money not only based on business sense, but also on ethical norms.
So are you saying that the more millions and the more zeros, the less ethics?
Absolutely. That's now the case with Oxford. We have filed a number of freedom of information requests, and what we learned is that the two external members, which were supposed to actually bring a view on ethics of this donation, these two external people, one of them is Baroness Neville Jones, and another one was a banker from Lloyd's Bank, Sir Victor Blank. They both had tarnished reputations, especially in due diligence in their own areas. So Baroness Neville Jones was discussed by British media at the time when she was on the committee. She was discussed, she was not promoted and criticized for having links to oligarchs, especially to her people took donations from Dmitry Firtash, another Ukrainian oligarch. And Sir Victor Blank, he almost lost his knighthood because of the way due diligence was carried out at Lloyd's Bank during financial crisis. So he had to retire in disgrace and almost lost his knighthood. So these two people were supposed to take an ethical decision on Blavatnik's donation, which is a joke. Kafka would envy such plot, I think.
Well, but it kind of supports the theory that Russian leadership seems to have that you can buy anything.
Exactly, and I mean, my only question is Western society okay with that? Are you okay with your top universities being essentially corrupted ethically, if not literally, by these very controversial figures who essentially robbed Russian people of and robbed Russian budget of its money? Do you want to teach global governance in mineral extraction industries under such names and with such money? And also, I want to say that I actually even doubt that this school is supposed to be independent, even if the money is bad. But it's not. It's involved in a lot of self-censorship. So this school of government hasn't touched even a single time on the topic of Putin, Ukraine, aggression in Europe, oligarchs. You can just Google. You can go to their website and Google and insert these keywords in their search, and it's just a joke. You have a major school of government in Europe, which avoids all these questions. And also I know that the head of the school, Professor Neri Woods, she denied an interview. She and the school, they denied an interview to New Yorker magazine, but one of the biggest interviews she gave was to Russia Today. So,
well, and if that isn't a flagship of honesty and truthfulness, then I don't know what is.
Exactly. So, in my view, just to come back to Carnegie, and I think if we accept values and practices from 100 years ago and say like what Carnegie did 100 years ago is okay and we can repeat it now, then Oxford University should drop its pretense to have ethical norms. They should stop doing photo ops with human rights activists, which they often do, because on many levels they try to convey this message that they are very much for human rights, they're very much for equality, they want global governance, transparency. So this case shows that all of that is just a hypocrisy. And then I would argue, if you believe in ideals of 100 years ago, then just drop pretense and just act as we did 100 years ago. But probably they don't want to do that. They want the best of both worlds. They want the money from 100 years ago, but they want the niceties and benefits of today's world. Well, in my view, it doesn't work like that.
Ilya Zaslavskiy is a research expert at Free Russia Foundation and energy consultant. Ilya, thank you so much for being on the program. How can people learn more about your battles, and if they want to get involved or spread the word or anything like that? What's the contact information we should let people know about?
Thanks for having me, and my contacts are very easy. You can just email me at Zaslavskiy in one word. That's my first initial and my last name, at iCloud.com, or you can just go to change.org and put in the search Putin Blavatnik or Putin Oxford as a keyword, and it will take you right to our petition.
Wonderful. Ilya, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.